Hello, y'all. Let's talk about nationalism today. So, in the early 19th century, there's kind of a real conflict between people who want more power in the federal government, which we will call federalism, and people who want more power in the states, the state government. Those were states' rights people. This had been an issue since the Constitution was written. But as the United States began to grow, a lot of people began to feel like we actually need more national power. We need the federal government to have more power over the states. One reason why they came to this conclusion was because of currency. So if states are using different currencies, how do you can't buy something from another state. You can't sell your products to someone in another state. So they began to argue that we need a national bank that would have like a uniform currency for the country, which of course makes sense. But this idea of a national bank, it kind of worried people who were really into states' rights, because they felt like this would be a case of the federal government taking on too much power over the states. Those states' rights people eventually lost this particular argument about the bank, because the Bank of the United States was created, and it was renewed again in the early 1800s. So many people were kind of coming to the conclusion that we need some more federal authority. Another issue was a tariff. So there were a lot of people who were against having a tariff. And I just kind of want to, if you're not familiar with tariffs, it's important to understand this, because the tariff becomes a really big issue in American history, especially in the 19th century. But many people were against a tax. So a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So consumers would generally be against the tariff because it makes prices higher for consumers. If you're in the market of buying British products to sell at your store, or to just buy for yourself, you would have to pay more money for British products because of a tariff that the federal government puts on imported goods. So the federal government adds a tax to all these goods that they import. Consumers would generally be against that. The people who would be for a tariff would be people who were making goods and products here in America. They wanted the government to create a tariff on imported goods so that imported goods would be more expensive than goods produced here in America. And they felt like this tariff would be the only way that American industries would have a chance. So American industries were new, and were just sort of developing their business model, and they couldn't compete with these English or French industries. They couldn't compete. They couldn't produce things as cheaply. So they wanted the federal government to put a tax on imported goods so that those goods would cost more for consumers. And that way they could sell their products less than imported goods. But it really means that they could still sell their products more than they would sell them if there weren't a tariff, because this tariff kind of inflates the price of imported goods so that American goods can inflate a little also, but just below the cost of an imported good. So a lot of industries, people in states with a lot of industries, so particularly the Northeast, they were in favor of a tariff to protect American industries and help them grow, while people mostly in the South and West who didn't have as much industry in their state, they would be against the tariff. So the tariff became another big issue, and it represented the argument between federal government and states' rights. A lot of states did not want to comply with the tariff. The federal government ultimately overruled them and passed the tariff of 1816. And that represented another sort of win for the people who wanted more federal power, the Federalists, not necessarily people of the Federalist Party, just people in favor of strong federal power. That tariff of 1816 was a big victory for them. there was another way in which the federal government took on more control of the states, and it was a Supreme Court case called McCullough versus Maryland, and there was another one that was very similar, Gibbons versus Ogden. Both of those cases went to the Supreme Court, and in both of those cases, the Supreme Court said that the federal government has jurisdiction of interstate commerce. And what that means is that any business transaction, selling goods or buying goods, any business transaction that takes place between different states. So if you produce cotton in Mississippi and you sell it to Virginia, that's interstate commerce. It crosses state lines. The Supreme Court said that anything that crosses state lines is under the jurisdiction of the federal government and not the states. And of course, that makes sense, because if Mississippi and Virginia have separate taxes and separate laws, it wouldn't work. You have to have sort of the same guidelines for commerce. So this Gibbons versus Ogden was a really important case, because in giving the federal government control of interstate commerce, that made the federal government have a lot more power. That meant that anything that crossed state lines would be under the jurisdiction of the federal government and not the states. And this becomes really important when we look at cotton, how cotton was sold from the South to the North. The federal government had authority over that trade of cotton. So these were a couple of ways in which nationalism became stronger in the early 1800s, this idea of looking at things from the national perspective instead of just the state's perspective. So nationalism grew. At around the same time, the country also grew. The United States acquired a lot more territory. This was the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. It's sometimes also called the Adams-Onis Treaty, referring to the two men who agreed on the treaty, John Quincy Adams and someone from England whose last name was Otis. So it's the same treaty, Transcontinental or Adams-Otis of 1819. It gave the United States more land. So it gave the US Florida, which had been under the control of Spain, and then it extended US territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And this did not include the American Southwest. What we now consider the Southwest was not included. That was still part of Mexico. So you have like Texas here, and then America's border kind of goes up from there, up until like around where Northern California or Oregon would be today. So the territory just kind of extends all the way to the west, but it leaves out California, Mexico, parts of Colorado, Arizona. Like that wasn't included in this territory. Those are like right here. So America expanded greatly, but still not complete to what we have today. But this is another example of nationalism, a stronger country, a stronger national country. One of the biggest issues that occurred in the early 1800s was the Missouri Compromise, or the Missouri Crisis. The compromise was actually how they fixed it. But the Missouri Crisis, y'all should read about that, or read about it in the textbook. And also there's a video I want you to watch about it. So I'm not going to explain what it actually was, but I do want to talk about why it was so important to maintain a balance of slave states and free states. This became very important from around 1819 up until the Civil War. Slave states in the South, people who lived in slave states, became very concerned that the federal government was trying to ban slavery. So the way that they could make sure this didn't happen was to ensure that they had a majority of pro-slave politicians in the federal government. And as y'all will recall from the chapter about the Constitution, we have two houses of Congress. The Senate has 2 members from each state. It doesn't matter how big the state, populous the state is. Every state has 2 senators. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, is based on population. So the amount of representatives each state has is based on that state's population. And because of the 3/5 compromise, Southern states had more representation in the House of Representatives. By the time of the Civil War, there were about 4.5 million slaves in the South. And all of those slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. So I'm not going to do the exact math here, but 3/5 of 4.5 million, that added a lot of people to the South's population. And those 3/5, those people who were slaves and counted as 3/5 of a person, they couldn't vote and they weren't legally considered people, but they were counted as 3/5 of a person for population. The South wanted that because it increased their representation in the House of Representatives. It also increased their representation in the Electoral College because that's also based on population. But the Senate is 2 members per state. So when there's an equal number of slave states and free states, that means that there is an equal number of pro-slave senators and anti-slave senators. And by 1820, that's how it was looking. If you were a senator from a northern state, you were almost guaranteed to be against slavery. If you were a senator from a southern state, you were definitely pro-slavery. You would not have gotten elected to Senate if you had expressed opposition to slavery. So all southern senators were pro-slavery and very avidly pro-slavery. They were very fearful that slavery would be banned someday. So it was a big thing, a big deal, that you had to have very strong pro-slave sentiment if you wanted to be elected to the Senate from a southern state. So this is why Southerners and Northerners wanted to maintain an equal balance of slave states and free states, because if the North had an extra state, a territory that became a state, and it was in the North, it would add 2 more senators from the North. And that meant that, it meant that those senators could pass a bill to ban slavery, because now they would have a majority in the Senate. So Southerners wanted to make sure that they had as many states in the South as were in the North. So this is why the Missouri Compromise had to be made. It was made to ensure an equal balance of slave states and free states. And the reason that this became an issue in the first place was because of the Louisiana Purchase. All this new territory that was brought into the country in 1803, it's like all this territory in the middle of the country. And that's when Southerners wanted to spread slavery west. There was all this new territory. In which the first state that had enough, the first territory that had enough people to apply for statehood was Missouri. And when we went to apply to become a state, this is when the Missouri crisis happened, because Northerners were saying, well, hey, if Missouri is a slave state, if Missouri enters the Union as a slave state, then the South will have more representation in the Senate. So they had to make sure that there was an equal balance of Southern states and Northern. So when Missouri became a slave state, Maine was added to the Union as a free state. Maine had been part of Massachusetts. They made it a separate state to keep the balance of states and free states. The Missouri Compromise also created this line that they drew across the country, and that separated slave states from free states. So watch the video for a little bit more clarification on where that line was. But I just wanted to explain why there was kind of an obsession of maintaining a balance between slave states and free states. All right, y'all, have a good week.